This BizNews production is brought to you by Brenthurst Wealth, South Africa's leading boutique wealth manager, trusted to guide families for over 20 years. Invest better with Brenthurst. Our next speaker is a man who holds one of the most important economic positions in the country. I was introduced to him by the late Greg Crumbach, a long-time DA Member of Parliament, somebody you've probably never heard of, but a critical member in the success of the Democratic Alliance in South Africa. He was the campaign manager for many years, and on his passing, Helen Ziller described him as, quote, a pillar of dedication and strategic brilliance. Greg was a wonderful human being on top of everything else, and he and Ashor worked very closely on the elections and the campaigns. Ashor now has that role as well. He's taken Greg's role in the DA. So again, behind the scenes, critically important. His rise in politics has been rapid. He became a chief whip in a major metro at the age of 22. And he's now serving as the Deputy Minister of Finance in our country. That's a big job, because you are surrounded by very bright people at the Treasury, probably brighter than any of the other arms of government, perhaps with the exclusion of the South African Reserve Bank and SARS. While we know him as a political strategist and a master of parliamentary finance committees, his academic background is not in economics or politics, but in science. He holds a BSc honors degree from Wits. He does have master's degrees, though, from Gibbs, as well as an MPhil in corporate strategy and an MPhil in international business. This guy, he's certainly been through the academic mill. But what did pop out in research on him is that his MBA research was on business models for the Internet of Things. So here's a guy who understands politics, who understands opposition politics. He's in the heart of the beast, if you like, knowing exactly where our tax money is going to. And he also has a very, very good feel for where the world is going, given his academic training. Please welcome a man with a passion for history, a background in science, a key role in shaping our economic future, Ashor Sarupen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alec. It's always tough following Frans Cronje because he's always a tough act to follow, and so I've got to be as engaging as Frans, which is always a difficult thing to do. I'm going to start my remarks today by reflecting a little bit on something that happened very early on in 2014 when I was first elected to the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, where I'm from. And at that stage, a slightly less economically literate member of the Executive Council said in a speech in response to the State of the Province address that South Africa doesn't need growth, that we don't need numbers in a graph. Now, of course, this was astounding to me because South Africa does need growth. And of course, growth was much better then, and we need lots and lots of it. And in South Africa, there's no such thing as jobless growth. If you look at our economic history, for every 1% that we get GDP growth, we get a 0.4 to 0.5% corresponding employment growth. That's the long-run employment elasticity of growth for those economists in the room, and it varies by sector and period. But on average, our economy has only grown by 1.194% a year since 2009, and we all know what happened in 2009. And our population growth during that same period has been 1.6% per annum. What does this mean? It means that every single year since 2009, on average, compounded, our country is getting poorer. And you see this in the substitution effect. Fewer BMWs, more sort of cherries and Havals is an example of this in real time that you see around you. Now, in simple terms, our economy is not keeping up with the number of people that we have. GDP per capita is shrinking, and with it, living standards are eroding. And as Frans said, unemployment sits at 33%, so I can skip over this bit of my speech, but youth joblessness is a catastrophe. And our debt burden means that we can't actually address this through the government fiscus, because 22 cents of every tax rand goes just to paying interest. Now, in that context, how do we turn this around? And I want to reflect a little bit on the work of Michael Porter, who was a Harvard Business School strategist, still is a Harvard Business School strategist. And he came up with frameworks for competitiveness, factors of competitiveness. And he argues that countries don't inherit prosperity, they create it. So he has a diamond model that identifies 4 interlocking factors that explains why economies succeed. The first is the factor conditions, quality of inputs like infrastructure, skills, and energy. Then, of course, demand conditions. You need a dynamic local market that forces innovation and efficiency. You need related supporting industries with competitive supplies and logistics. And then, of course, you need a competitive economy with firms that have strategy, structure, and rivalry. Government can shape some of these conditions, but countries must constantly upgrade their competitive advantages. And in this model, the model that I follow, one of the many things I learned at Gibbs, was that government can only play a secondary role in all of this and in shaping it. So government can support or hinder growth by investing in infrastructure and education, or not, by setting pro-competitive minimal regulations, and encouraging competition between firms rather than protecting the laggards. And I think we all know about the terrible choices of protectionism that has happened in our economy. So if we look at South Africa through Porter's lens, the diagnosis is stark. Our diamond has cracked. Our energy system is inefficient. Our ports and freight rail choke our exports and imports. And more importantly, our municipalities can no longer provide the basic services in large parts of the country for water, power, and roads. Each of these failures map directly to the factors I've just outlined, and each holds back growth, jobs, and investments. That's why I want to focus my speech today on the 3 base-level things. We can get into labor market reform, we can get into BE and those sorts of things, but if we don't fix these basics first, these are not technical or policy fixes, these are real infrastructure fixes, energy, logistics, and local governments. And if we're going to rebuild competitiveness and begin to get growth above 1%, these things need to work. I think the energy crisis remains the most immediate threat to growth and our economy's ability to advance. We've all lived through the daily reality of load shedding. Load shedding started when I was in my first year at university. I am now in my mid-30s, and it is still comes and goes. So we have kids who have known nothing but load shedding in their entire lives now, which is quite astounding. But beyond that, South Africa has gone from having some of the cheapest electricity in the world to the 20th most expensive. And that's critical when you think about competitiveness. And it's also a key driver of inflation in our economy. Since 2009, again, I keep using that year, electricity prices have gone up 400%, while prices in the real economy have gone up about 193%. So you can see what drives the cost of living issues in our country. And of course, we have recently lived through the worst year of load shedding on record in 2023. But it's critical to understand that energy availability and growth in energy supply tracks economic growth. And while load shedding costs our economy in 2023 costs about 2.8 trillion rand alone, nearly a third of our GDP wiped out through load shedding. Power outages shave 1 to 1.3% of our GDP every year, but the cost inflation associated with the compounded failures in our energy monopoly means that we render our economy increasingly uncompetitive relative to our peers. Why would you invest in a country where you may or may not get electricity? When you do get electricity, some of the most expensive in the world with emerging market conditions. And so we can tie unemployment and low growth directly to this energy crisis, and it's an energy pricing crisis. And no country can create jobs or attract investments if it cannot guarantee stability of supply and stability of pricing. People who are engaged in planning and operations managers across an economy would have to think about cost inflation first before they plan around hiring and expansion of businesses. And so energy is the lifeblood of our economy, and whether we have load shedding or not, for as long as we have price inflation, growth will be choked. If we could solve the supply stability problem and the supply pricing problem, our anemic growth could double or triple in the short term. J.P. Landman once said to me that we could easily add an extra 1% of GDP per year if we could get a competitive energy market moving. So the good news is we know what the solutions are. It involves the unbundling of Eskom and the creation of a competitive energy market where power producers compete to supply electricity to consumers through a competitive market. And we have to move away from the structural constraints of a single decade-old monopoly towards a modern decentralized system. And this is a major structural reform needed in our economy because it means that private companies, municipalities, and even individuals can easily generate and trade power. And over time, that investment, innovation, and much needed extra capacity in our grid will stabilize pricing. And yes, while the legal framework is in place, and I frequently get frustrated, but the World Bank did tell me that this is the quickest change in electricity regulation they've seen in any market in the world, the implementation is lacking and needs to move more quickly. We need that competitive energy market envisioned in the Energy Regulation Act. And we have to confront some of the financial woes in our system, including the massive municipal debt to Eskom, now over 95 billion, which threatens the viability of the energy sector. The state has absorbed a portion of Eskom debt, rightly or wrongly, but Eskom's business must be put onto a sustainable footing so that we can begin to unbundle it appropriately in order to deal with the competitive energy market and create it. Now, that is the first part of the choke and growth, and the first part of our network industries, which is energy. The second big failure, and France mentioned it, is ports. Ports and railways. They keep the wheels of the economy turning, and we've long prided ourselves on being the trade hub for Africa. Everything, even all the way up to the DRC, historically has been exported through Durban. We're a mining exporter, and that made us an attractive location for manufacturing, agriculture, and other investments. But that potential is being strangled by the dysfunction of the freight rail system and the port system. Put bluntly, they've become a stumbling block to growth. And if we don't fix them, we will not be able to attract investment. We have strategic ports, Cape Town, Durban, Port Elizabeth, and so on. Yet shockingly, 4 of South Africa's major ports ranked amongst the worst performing in the world last year by the World Bank. And the World Bank's Container Port Performance Index, Cape Town was dead last, 405 out of 405 ranked. Durban was 398 and Port Elizabeth was 391. And to me, this is a national embarrassment as well as a serious economic handicap. Such poor port performance means ships wait longer to load or unload, costs go up, and shippers avoid our harbors. Inefficient ports raise the cost of imports and exports, reduce our competitiveness, and ultimately hinder growth and poverty reduction down to the bare minimum. And when we look at our freight rail system, the story is similar, or perhaps worse. Our rail network under Transnet is meant to be the backbone to carry commodities such as minerals and heavy goods from inland, from our neighboring countries, to the ports. But Transnet's chronic underperformance, the era of state capture, and its failure to invest in its infrastructure stifled exports of key commodities like coal and iron ore, costing our mines and our country billions in revenue. Major companies like Kumba Iron Ore and Tungela Coal have had to curtail production simply because they can't get their product to port. And between 2021 and 2023, South Africa missed out on an estimated 98 billion rand in coal and iron ore export earnings just to the freight rail constraints before we even get to the ports. That was according to the Minerals Council. That's 100 billion rand of foregone foreign exchange, money that should have been flowing into our economy, providing jobs and tax receipts. Agriculture is affected too. Delays and issues at the Cape Town port cost the Western Cape fruit farmers about 1 billion in lost produce last year because it was rotting before it could be exported. Now, these figures are staggering, and it shows that we're shooting ourselves in the foot by clinging to structural monopolies in our economy. So what's gone wrong? Of course, state capture, mismanagement, underinvestment, corruption, and monopoly control have left these systems in decay. Transnet is barely moving 2/3 of the tonnage it did a decade ago on its freight rail system. Of course, theft and vandalism and a high-crime economy have exacerbated the problem, with entire lines out of service for long periods. Now, how do we fix this? And of course, the key word is structural reform, words that are developed by the IMF, but we like to use it anyway. We need to have a competitive sector. not just in energy, but also in ports and logistics, because the monopoly system has failed. Transnet is the only company in the world of its kind that is a port and rail owner, operator, employer, and regulator. Nothing else like it exists. No other country. China, Dubai, forget the West. Even in Latin America, nothing like it exists. And so, the public-private partnership and concession agreements to let the private sector run these systems, to concession our port terminals, to let third-party private operators in the freight rail network, to concession out the key rail lines, are absolutely critical. Firstly, to break the monopoly, and secondly, to maximize competitiveness. If we can sort out this logistics problem, the Bureau for Economic Research estimates that we could add up to 2 percentage points to our annual GDP growth. Now, energy gives us 1, port and freight rail gives us 2. That's already 3%. That's 3/5 of the way to where we need to be to solve our problems. Now, there's a third area, and it's because economic activity doesn't occur in a vacuum or in boardrooms. It happens in cities and towns, and you can't have a thriving national economy if the local government system is dysfunctional. And local government is in a crisis, and that crisis is impeding growth and investment at every turn. Municipalities are responsible for trading services, energy distribution, water supply, sanitation, roads, and waste removal. These are the basic services that enable businesses and citizens to live their lives. And when they fail, it undermines commerce, health, and quality of life. Now, of the 257 municipalities in South Africa, only 34 received clean audits in 2023. They racked up 7.4 billion rand in fruitless and wasteful expenditure that year, money essentially down the drain due to corruption and incompetence. 76% of all municipalities are deemed at risk or distressed financially and institutionally. Municipal water infrastructure is now so neglected that over 40% of municipal water is lost to leaks before it even reaches consumers, and billions of rands of water literally leak into the ground every year. Our trading services that used to generate profits for municipalities are now loss-making. Johannesburg Water revealed that its water losses are at an astounding 46%, and it loses 2.4 billion a year in water losses. So, who is going to invest in the country and build a factory if the municipality can't guarantee water or electricity supply? If it takes months to get permits due to mismanagement. And we all know the problems: poor governance, very weak politicians, lack of accountability, cadre deployment and patronage networks. All of these things drive political instability in our municipalities that result in institutional instability. Now, in this context, along with the financial model of municipalities, it's clear that we need serious reform. And I just want to take a moment to explain the model as it stands. We all pay for electricity and water and so on, but we pay at a profit to our municipality. They put all of their other charges into it. And when you pay for electricity, you're not just paying for electricity, you're paying for city parks to be cleaned, those sorts of things. And what this means is that when you pay your bill, it goes into the General Municipal Revenue Fund, and it can be spent however the politicians determine it can be spent. 100 political advisors in the mayor's office, if they so desire, bloated staff structures. And what we've seen over the last decade, the last 15 years really, is that the cost of employees in municipalities have ballooned, but the investments, the capex budgets have declined dramatically. In the Ekurhuleni municipality where I'm from, the capex budget when I was a city councillor in 2011 was 5 billion rand a year to replace water, sewage works, treatment plants, electricity reticulation infrastructure. It's now down to 2 billion rand, all grant funded. Now, if you account for inflation between 2011 and 2025, just to stay where they were, they would need a 10 billion rand capital budget. But the cost of employees has ballooned. And so, to rescue our basic services and protect them, we have started a program under my leadership of the Treasury called Metro Trading Services Reform, starting with the big municipalities. And what we are doing is requiring municipalities to ring-fence their water, electricity, refuse removal, and sewage business units as utilities. And so when you pay your bill, there must be transparency in the costing and supply. What does it actually cost to get electricity to the user? The entire model. Pay the bulk supplier, Eskom, for example. make sure that you have all your future planning done for your electricity infrastructure, your reticulation network, fixing the wires, the cables, accounting for theft, and of course, not waiting for some other department of the municipality to give you a bucky. You need to have that ring-fenced in your own unit. Turn this into a business unit and ring-fence the revenues for electricity in there to stabilize supply. It does mean that as this is implemented, that other things in the municipality, like city strategy and city 2027 documents or city 2070 strategy plans, will have to disappear because the municipalities will not be able to afford those nice-to-haves. But it's absolutely critical. But more importantly, it opens the way for us to have competitive private players to now move into this space. There are 2 municipalities that have concessioned out their water systems. That is Mbombela in Mpumalanga and KwaDukuza in KwaZulu-Natal. And those work very well because the private sector runs, reticulates, goes all the way down to billing in some cases, collects the revenue, depoliticizes revenue collection. So you don't have a councillor saying that there won't be disconnections in my ward. And that helps stabilize the services. And so moving towards a system where we run in a utility model with business units is going to be absolutely critical to rescue local government and depoliticize things like revenue collection. So I see I've got a minute left. So in my last minutes, I just want to say that these challenges are enormous, and I have only begun to scratch the surface on 3 structural issues. There are many other policy areas that need reform, but the cost of inaction is biting. We've endured a decade of stagnation with growth barely above 1%, while our population grew faster. Living standards have stagnated and contributed to all of the problems we see, the unemployment and the frustration that is boiling over, leading to protests and other negative actions. And we can't afford another decade like this. So the agenda I've outlined is the starting point. Getting power supply stable and pricing stable, unclogging those transport arteries, and rebuilding capacity in local government. It's fundamentally about growth. If we can achieve these, we can realistically lift growth to exceed the 1.6% population growth threshold, so that GDP per capita starts rising again rather than falling. And of course, there's no reason we can't grow at 4 or 5% a year with the right policies. We still have the most industrialized economy in Africa. We have abundant natural resources. We have a young population. And we've got an entrepreneurial spirit waiting to be unleashed. What's held us back has been internal bottlenecks of our own making. Remove those, and the innate advantages of our country can shine. And growth is not a luxury, it's a necessity, but it depends on those factors of competitiveness. Without growth, we can't reduce unemployment, we cannot ease the cost of living crisis, and we cannot stabilize our debts. But with growth, everything becomes possible. More jobs, rising incomes for families, stronger revenues for the state, and renewed confidence for investors. Michael Porter shows us that prosperity is created when countries deliberately build the conditions for competitiveness. And our task is clear. Build the competitive factors, and we can rebuild our country. So the choice is stark. We can decline through drift, or we can renew through structural reform. And certainly doing my bit to fight every day for structural reform. Thank you very much.
This BizNews production is brought to you by Brenthurst Wealth, a multi-award-winning, truly independent boutique wealth manager. Invest better with Brenthurst.